In the last chapter, we took a deep look at the 7 minimum viable capabilities and how each one plays a distinct role in keeping an organization's operations aligned with its intent. We saw how govern and assure act as the directional core, how plan and design prepare the ground, how change and execute drive action, and how innovate keeps the system from calcifying. But knowing the capabilities is only half the work. The harder question is, how do those capabilities actually function at the places where things can go wrong? Chapter 7 is where the model meets the ground. It is about working at boundaries, which is where value is created, where risk concentrates, and where governance either earns its keep or quietly fails. The central tool in this chapter is something called minimum viable governance. Not governance as a committee, not governance as a compliance calendar, but governance as a practical discipline for keeping specific promises at specific points in the operation. To do that, we need a way to connect leadership questions to operational reality. That connection is built through a structure called QOQM, and that is what this chapter is here to explain. Let us start with the problem this chapter is solving. Picture a vertical line. At the top, leadership, and at the bottom, operations. The line connecting them looks clean and direct on an org chart. In practice, something very different happens. The space between those 2 points fills up with noise. That noise takes many forms. It is dashboards full of metrics that look stable but do not answer the questions executives actually care about. It is reports that describe activity rather than outcomes. It is a growing fog between what leaders think is happening and what is actually happening at the places where the work gets done. Minimum viable governance is the discipline of cutting through that fog. Rather than trying to monitor everything, it asks a more focused question. At the boundaries where value crosses hands and where failure concentrates, what is the minimum we need to know and do to keep our promises? The answer to that question lives in what we call the quality outcome and quality metric structure, or QOQM. That structure is what transforms vague intentions into observable, verifiable commitments. Before we get into the mechanics of QOQM, it helps to ground ourselves in the kinds of questions governance is actually supposed to answer. The slide in front of you shows 4 of them, and none of them is complicated. Are we one incident away from being front-page news? Are we spending the right amount on cyber and in the right places? Could a supplier failure take us out for a week? Are we actually getting better, or just getting better at writing reports? These are not trick questions. They are the questions a thoughtful board member or a responsible executive would naturally ask when they are trying to understand whether the organization is genuinely resilient. They are clear, they are human, and they are entirely reasonable. The problem, as the slide notes, is that executives rarely receive direct, operational answers to these questions. What they typically receive instead are technically accurate but strategically useless responses. Metrics that describe a process rather than confirm an outcome, compliance percentages that do not say whether the underlying risk is controlled, or status updates written in framework language that requires a specialist to decode. The gap between the question and the answer is not a communications problem. It is a structural problem, and QOQM is designed to fix it. Here is what that structural problem looks like in practice. On the left side of this slide, you see a familiar collection of security metrics: patch compliance at 98%, phishing click-through rates, high-severity vulnerability counts, CM alert volumes. These are standard outputs from experienced security teams. They are real numbers, they are consistently produced, and they represent genuine operational effort. On the right side of the slide is a figure standing at the edge of a gap, looking across at a target he cannot reach. That image captures what happens when boards and executives receive these metrics. They are forced to treat them as a cipher, hoping that someone on the operational side has already translated the organization's strategic questions into these measurable signals, and that the translation holds up under pressure. The problem is that implicit translation is incomplete and rarely tested. Patch compliance at 98% tells you something about process discipline. It does not tell you whether settlement operations can survive a cyber disruption. CM alert volumes tell you about detection activity. They do not tell you whether the right thresholds are set at the right boundaries, or whether anyone would act fast enough if those thresholds were crossed. The metrics are not wrong. They are just not connected to the questions that matter most. To understand what happens when governance fails at the boundary, consider the Colonial Pipeline incident. The sequence laid out on this slide tells the story in 3 nodes. First, DarkSide ransomware infects the company's IT network. Second, there is unclear cross-contamination risk between the IT environment and the operational technology systems that actually control the pipeline. Third, the enterprise makes a decision to shut down roughly 45% of fuel delivery to the East Coast of the United States. Here is what makes this case so instructive. The shutdown was not caused by the ransomware itself reaching the pipeline controls. The problem at Node 2 was that no predefined, tested recovery thresholds existed at the boundary between the IT world and the operational technology world. When the incident happened, the organization did not have a tested answer to the question: how far can contamination spread before we must act? And what does safe degraded operation actually look like? In the absence of that answer, the enterprise chose a blind shutdown over uncertain risk. It is an understandable decision under the circumstances, but it is also the definition of governance failure at the boundary. As the insight box on this slide puts it, governance is not a committee. It is the capability to set operational limits and act on evidence quickly at the boundary. Colonial Pipeline did not lack policies or frameworks. It lacked a tested, predefined answer to the question that mattered most when the moment arrived. So how do we build that answer in advance? That is where QQM comes in. The structure has 2 parts, and the diagram on this slide uses a tree metaphor to explain how they relate. The first part is the question outcome, or QO. Think of this as the roots and branches of the tree. A question outcome takes a leadership question and decomposes it into a set of verifiable outcomes at the exact boundaries where the work actually happens. It is not a goal statement. It is not a framework requirement. It is a specific, testable declaration of what must be true at a particular point in the operation for the organization to be keeping its promise. The second part is the question metric, or QM. These are the leaves. A question metric is the practical minimum signal from everyday operations that tells you whether the specific outcome you have declared is actually holding. It is observed, sampled, or tested in the course of normal work, not gathered for the purpose of producing reports. Together, the QO and the QM form a connected chain. From the leadership question, down through branch outcomes at each operational boundary, to the live signals that confirm or challenge those outcomes in real time. Let us spend a moment on what makes a good question outcome, because the quality of the QO determines whether the entire structure works. The slide gives us a specific example drawn directly from the Colonial Pipeline situation. Fuel delivery can be sustained or safely degraded under cyber disruption, within defined operational limits. Notice 2 things about that statement. First, it is written in plain language. A non-specialist leader can read it and immediately understand what it means. There are no framework acronyms, no compliance references, no technical jargon requiring translation. Second, it is a positive declaration of what must be true, not a requirement to complete a task. It says nothing about patching within 30 days or completing a control assessment. It describes an operational condition. The system can sustain or safely degrade. That is the distinction the slide labels as a promise, not a control. The other quality worth noting is what the slide calls language shifting. At the root of the tree, a question outcome is written in leadership language, the kind of sentence a board member could read and react to. As the tree branches down toward specific operational boundaries, the language shifts to operational terms that the teams responsible for those boundaries will recognize. The QO speaks both languages at once, which is precisely what allows it to connect the 2. Now let us look at the question metric side of the pair. The slide draws a deliberate contrast between 2 categories of signal. On the left are formal audit artifacts: checklists, quarterly reviews, calendar-driven assessments. On the right is everyday work telemetry, live system readouts, response time gauges, signals that come from the operation itself as it runs. The distinction matters because formal audit artifacts tend to reflect a snapshot in time, assembled for the purpose of review, and often shaped by what teams believe reviewers want to see. Everyday work telemetry is harder to stage. It comes from actual system behavior, actual transaction volumes, actual response times. It is, as the slide puts it, the most honest minimum signal available to determine whether the QO promise is being kept. The key phrase in the banner at the bottom of the slide deserves attention. QMs are observed, sampled, or tested during everyday work at the pace that matters for the boundary, not gathered merely for formal reviews. This is a subtle but important distinction. A quarterly report on patch compliance is not a QM. A live signal showing how many privileged accounts have been reviewed in the last 30 days, compared against anomalies detected and investigated, is much closer. The QM lives in the rhythm of the work, not in the reporting calendar. Let us make this concrete by returning to Meridian, the mid-sized financial services firm we have been using throughout this series. The slide shows a full QOQM tree built around a root outcome that reflects one of Meridian's most critical operational promises. Critical settlement obligations at Meridian are met on time, even if a single named supplier fails. That root outcome branches into two sub-outcomes. On the left, settlement processing can be rerouted to an alternate path within a defined window. On the right, reconciliation backlog remains within defined limits during degraded mode. Each of those branches then produces its own set of metrics, the leaves of the tree. For the rerouting branch, the relevant signals are time to failover measured across both drills and live events, and failover success rate. For the reconciliation branch, the signals are backlog size, time to clear backlog, and exception rate during recovery. The sidebar on the right of the slide offers a key observation. When this tree is tracked over time, leadership sees not just green status, but exactly which operational branches are drifting. That is the difference between a dashboard that tells you everything is fine and a tree that tells you specifically where confidence is eroding. Meridian's leadership can look at this structure and have a real conversation about whether their settlement boundary is as resilient as it needs to be, grounded in actual telemetry rather than in a reassuring color. The Meridian example is one boundary. The table on this slide shows how the same structure scales across three different types of boundaries, each with its own QO and its own set of QMs. At the privileged access boundary, the outcome is that no unauthorized account has standing access to settlement processing beyond its required scope. The metric signals are the proportion of privileged accounts reviewed within 30 days, and the ratio of anomalies detected to anomalies investigated. At the deployment boundary, the outcome is that a problematic release can be rolled back before causing more than a defined number of customer impacts. The signals are rollbacks per 100 deployments over a 90-day window, an average time from detection to rollback. At the supplier boundary, the outcome is that service continuity at the counterparty API is maintained within contract limits during a supplier failure. The signals are quarterly failover test results and time to detection and rerouting during live incidents. Each row in this table follows the same logic. One clear promise at one specific boundary, confirmed by the most direct and honest signals available from everyday operations. What you will also notice is that these outcomes span what earlier chapters described as the create, protect, and deliver functions of the organization. QOQM is not a cybersecurity tool or a resilience tool or an audit tool. It is the connective tissue that makes all of those conversations coherent. Building a QOQM tree is one thing. Knowing whether it is actually working is another. This slide presents 6 diagnostic questions that serve as a practical test for whether a given tree has landed in the organization or is still just a document on a shelf. The questions are worth reading slowly. Can a non-specialist leader read the QO without translating framework acronyms? If the answer is no, the outcome is written for the wrong audience. If the QM moves the wrong way, does someone feel compelled to act rather than dismiss it as noise? If the answer is no, the metric is not connected to anything that matters. Does the QM connect to observable boundary evidence, not just general good practice? If the answer is no, the metric is measuring activity, not condition. Would a drifting branch actually change a real decision, priority, or trade-off? If the answer is no, the tree is decorative. Is the QM difficult to game? Or is there a secondary signal that would reveal gaming? If the answer is no, you are likely measuring what people want you to see. And finally, is there a sustained operating routine with a clear owner, a review cadence, and an action trigger? If the answer is no, the tree has no pulse. The note at the bottom of the slide is direct. If most answers are no, the QOQM tree has not yet landed. This scorecard is not a critique. It is a calibration tool, and it is meant to be used honestly. Here is something that becomes clear once you have worked through the QOQM structure. It is not just a governance tool. It is the shared language that makes all 7 minimum viable capabilities coherent. The diagram on this slide shows the QOQM pair at the center of a wheel, with each of the 7 capabilities arranged around it. Govern uses the tree to set non-negotiable outcomes and the trade-offs that protect them. Assure uses it as a direct pass or fail test script. Plan allocates capacity based on which branches are drifting. Design translates the outcomes into architectural patterns. Change uses QM as a before and after measure for deployments. Execute gives on-call teams context on what they are protecting. And Innovate treats the tree as a hypothesis surface for experiments, using branches that have underperformed as candidates for targeted improvement. This is what integration looks like in practice. It is not 7 separate processes aligned by a governance committee. It is 7 capabilities all reading from the same set of promises and the same evidence, coordinated not by bureaucracy, but by shared clarity about what the organization is trying to protect and prove. One of the less obvious benefits of QOQM is what it does to the quality of conversation inside an organization. The slide captures this by contrasting 2 ways of reporting the same situation. On the left in the red box, the patch compliance metric is trending down against the ISO framework requirement. On the left in the green box, the outcome at this boundary is at risk. The telemetry shows it. Here is the deployment decision we must change. The first version is technically accurate and operationally useless to a decision maker. It reports a deviation from a framework standard. It requires the listener to translate that deviation into a consequence, to ask whether it matters, and to figure out what action it calls for. The second version skips all of that. It names the boundary, states the condition, connects it to evidence, and points directly to the decision. The progression timeline on the right side of the slide names 3 things that shift when organizations make this move. Translation loss between engineers and executives disappears. Focus shifts from passing audits to keeping specific promises. And psychological safety improves because the conversation is no longer about whether someone performed well enough. It is about whether a boundary condition is holding, which is a much more productive question to be in the room with. Before closing the chapter, it is worth naming the ways QOQM tends to go wrong, because each failure mode has a specific fix. The first failure mode is mapping everything at once, creating a massive list of outcomes and metrics that nobody owns. The fix is to start with one uncomfortable question at one fragile boundary. Do not try to build the whole tree before you understand whether the structure works. The second failure mode is vague outcomes, statements like improve security posture or be resilient. These sound reasonable but cannot be verified. The fix is specificity. An outcome must be precise enough to confirm via today's work, not just aspirational enough to appear in a strategy document. The third failure mode is convenient metrics, relying on data that is easy to gather rather than data that is honest. Patch counts and training completion rates are easy. They are also easy to satisfy without actually reducing risk. The fix is to ask, is this the most honest signal available, or just the most available signal? The fourth failure mode is tying QMs to personal performance ratings. When individual evaluations depend on a metric, people optimize for the metric rather than the underlying condition. The fix is to keep QM in the domain of evidence and learning, not accountability and judgment. A metric that feels like surveillance produces gaming. A metric that feels like a compass produces improvement. Chapter 7 closes with what the slide calls the narrative backbone of governance, and it is worth taking a moment to let this land. The diagram shows an infinity loop made of 3 elements: the promise, the evidence, and the action. Here are the outcomes that matter most at this part of the system. Here is how the organization observes them in everyday work. Here is what changed as a result of what the organization saw. That loop is not a framework. It is not a compliance requirement. It is the most basic description of what governance actually is when it is working. An organization that can name its promises clearly, observe evidence against those promises in real time, and act on what it sees has the foundation of genuine resilience. An organization that cannot do those three things is, at best, operating on hope. The concluding statement at the bottom of the slide puts it precisely. QOQM is not a new tool, control catalog, or committee. It is the discipline of clarity regarding what the organization promises and honesty regarding what it delivers. In the next chapter, we will take this discipline further and examine how it scales across the full operating model, connecting boundary-level governance to the enterprise conversations that depend on it.